Okay, so this lecture is going to cover tissues. As we know, when you have a bunch of cells, a group of cells that are similar, performing the same function, they form what is called a tissue. Okay, and there are several different types of tissue classes. Okay, there are 4 main types, and they are epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscular. So we are going to go through each of these 4 basic types. We are going to talk about individual types. We're going to talk about where they are found and their characteristics. And you are going to be responsible for knowing their individual characteristics and where they can be found in the body. So, epithelial. They have 5 distinguishing characteristics. They are closely packed cells. They are attached to connective tissue by a basement membrane. Tissue surface is opposite the basement membrane, is not attached to other tissues. There are no blood vessels, and they regenerate rapidly. They serve in protection. Epithelial protect deeper tissues from invasion and injury. The epidermis, for example, is a barrier to infection, and the inner lining of the stomach protects its deeper tissues from stomach acid and enzymes. They deal in secretion. Epithelia produce mucus, sweat, enzymes, hormones, and most of the body's other secretions, such as glands, and because glands are composed largely of epithelial tissue. They deal in excretion. Epithelia void waste from the tissue, such as CO2, across the pulmonary epithelium and bile from the epithelium of the liver. They deal in absorption. Epithelia absorb chemicals from the adjacent medium. Nearly all nutrients, for example, are absorbed through the epithelium of the small intestine. They deal in filtration. All substances leaving the blood are selectively filtered through the epithelium that lines the blood vessels. All urinary waste is filtered through epithelial of the kidneys. They also deal in sensation. Epithelia are provided with nerve endings that sense stimulation ranging from the touch on the skin to irritation of the stomach. The functions vary with location and tissue type, and we just talked about all the different functions. Glandular epithelium can be found inside glands, both exocrine and endocrine glands. So, first we have simple epithelium. Simple epithelium has only 1 layer of cells, although this is somewhat debatable point in pseudostratified, which we will talk about. There are basically 3 types of simple epithelial, and they are named for the shape of the cells. So we are going to see that we have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and simple columnar. And then there's also what's called pseudostratified columnar. Simple epithelial deals with diffusion, secretion, and filtration. So the first type here is simple squamous epithelium. Here we see that this type of tissue allows for rapid diffusion of transport or substances through membranes, and they also can secrete a lubricating serous fluid. This can be found in the air sacs or the alveoli of the lungs. It can be found in the glomerular capsule of kidneys, in the kidney tubules. It can be found in the heart and the blood vessels, in the serous membranes of the stomach, intestine, and some other viscera. It is also in the pleura, pericardium, peritoneum, and mesenteries. Then we have simple cuboidal epithelium. And these look like cubes, hence the name. They deal in absorption and secretion, and production of protective mucus coat and the movement of respiratory mucus. They are found in the liver, thyroid, mammary glands, salivary glands, and in most kidney tubules and bronchioles. Then we have simple columnar epithelium. These look more, instead of cubes, they look like little columns. Again, hence the name. They deal in absorption and secretion of mucus and other products, and the movement of egg and embryo in the uterine tube. They are found in the inner lining of the stomach, intestines, gallbladder, uterus, uterine tubes, and kidney tubules. And they have some distinguishing factors, such as goblet cells, which are the large cells here that you see in the photo, cilia, and microvilli. Goblet cells produce protective mucus coatings over the mucous membranes. These cells have an expanded apical end filled with secretory vesicles. Their product becomes mucus when it is secreted and absorbs water. We also said that there are cilia and microvilli, and these items can increase surface area, which aids in the absorption. And since we see this in the intestines, that would make sense because our intestines absorb a lot of nutrients. Then we have what's called pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. I mean, if that isn't a mouthful, I don't know what is. But basically, it's a fake stratified. When we get to the next section here, we're going to see that stratifieds have more than one layer. And these look like they have more than one layer, but they do not. Hence why they are fake stratified. Okay? These also possess goblet cells, and they secrete and propel mucus. They are found in the respiratory tract from the nasal cavity to the bronchi and in portions of the male urethra. And you can see here on that, and the pictures, because of the way that they're set up, they look like they're stacked on one another when in reality they are not. Okay, and then that brings us to the true stratified epithelium. So basically, in stratified epithelia, we have a range from 2 to 20 or more layers of cells, with some cells resting directly on others and only the very deepest layer being attached to the basement membrane. There are 3 types of stratified epithelia, named again for their shapes: stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar. Then we also have a 4th type that kind of is in between, and that is called transitional epithelium. So let's look at these guys in closer detail. Here it also says that the innermost layer undergoes meiotic cell division, and that the surface cells are constantly lost, so they're constantly being sloughed off, and that one of the main functions is protection. So the first one is stratified squamous, and it comes in 2 types, keratinized and non-keratinized. Let's talk about keratinized first. The functions of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium are that they resist abrasion and penetration by pathogenic organisms, and they also retard water loss through the skin. They are found in the epidermis, on your palms and your soles, and this is where we see the most heavily keratinized cells and tissue. Your palms and your soles are very different than anywhere else on your body, and that is because they are keratinized tissue because they get a lot of action, right? So they're a little bit tougher. Then we have the other kind, which is non-keratinized. And this is, it's basically the same, but it doesn't have that extra layer of rough cells because this area actually gets use. Hence, that the top layer is always being sloughed off and you don't build up that tougher skin. It also resists abrasion and penetration of pathogenic organisms, and it can be found on the tongue, in the oral mucosa, esophagus, anal canal, and vagina. We are missing a slide. We are missing a slide on the stratified cuboidal epithelium. So that functions, it contributes to sweat secretion, it secretes ovarian hormones and produces sperm, and it can be found in sweat gland ducts, egg-producing vesicles, follicles of the ovaries, sperm-producing ducts, and sperm-producing ducts of the testes. Well, I'm sorry, that one is missing. Then we have transitional. Transitional epithelium stretches to allow filling of the urinary tract. It is found in the urinary tract, part of the kidney, ureter, bladder, part of the urethra, and the umbilical cord. So the transitional is a little bit different because it allows for stretching, which is one of its main characteristics. It flattens out once it's stretched. All right, then we get into the second type of cells. We have an epithelium. Secondly, we have connective tissues. Connective tissues are the most abundant. They are widely distributed and histologically variable. They include fibrous tissue, adipose, cartilage, bone, and blood. They are such a diverse group of tissues that they may actually even seem that they are not all related, right? So they deal in binding of organs. Tendons bind muscle to bone, and ligaments bind one bone to another. Fat holds the kidneys and eyes in place, and fibrous tissue binds the skin of underlying muscle. They support. Bones support the body, and cartilage supports the ears, nose, and trachea. They deal in physical protection because, again, it's your bones. They deal in immune protection. Connective tissue cells can attack foreign invaders because it's the blood. They deal in movement because your bones provide the lever system for body movement. They deal in storage. Fat is the body's major energy reserve. Bone is a reservoir of calcium and phosphorus that can be drawn upon when needed. They deal in heat production. Metabolism of brown fat generates heat in infants and children. And they deal in transport because your blood, which is a connective tissue, transports gases, nutrients, waste, hormones, and blood cells. They are never found on exposed surfaces, and they have the ability to regenerate. They consist of a few loosely arranged cells, an intercellular substance called a matrix. There are two broad categories. Connective tissue proper, which is common tissues that bind one tissue and organs, and connective tissues with specialized functions. Connective tissue proper functions in binding together other tissues and to support a framework of organs. The matrix consists of what's called a ground substance. We see fibroblasts, which are the most abundant cells in connective tissue, and we also sometimes see collagen and elastic fibers. These are different fibers that we see in certain kinds of connective tissues. Back to the ground substance. Ground substance usually has a gelatinous to rubbery consistency resulting from three types of large molecules. It absorbs compression forces, and like the styrofoam packing in a shipping carton, it protects more delicate cells from mechanical injury. Okay, so the first one we encounter here is loose connective tissue. Much of the space is occupied by ground substance, which is dissolved out of the tissue during histological fixation and leaves empty space in prepared tissue sections. It attaches skin to muscles, and it can be found in the framework for internal organs, nerves, and blood vessels. It also deals with immune reactions. Then we have adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fat, and it has adipocytes, which are the dominant cell type. Adipocytes may also occur singly in small clusters in areolar tissue, but it is usually found here. Adipose tissue is a primary energy reservoir, and it also aids in cushioning organs. It also deals in thermal isolation and heat production. It is found in the subcutaneous fat beneath the skin, in the breast, heart surfaces, mesenteries, and surrounding organs such as the kidneys and the eyes. Okay, and then we have a category called fibrous connective tissues. And here we find tightly packed collagen, we can see elastic fibers, and basically what happens with these types of tissues is that they allow for strength and flexibility. So we see these types of tissues in ligaments, tendons, and the dermis. They also, though, do not have a good blood supply, which means that they heal rather slowly. So we have areolar tissue, we have reticular tissue, we have dense regular connective tissue, and dense irregular connective tissue. Those are the four types of fibrous connective tissue that we see. We see areolar tissue basically underneath the epithelium, It basically loosely binds epithelial to deeper tissues and allows passage of nerves and blood vessels through other tissues. We see the reticular tissue in places like the lymphatic organs, in the lymph nodes, spleen, thymus, and bone marrow. We see dense regular connective tissue in the tendons and ligaments. And here they act to bind bones together and resist stress. And then we have dense irregular connective tissue. And we see this in the dermis of the skin. It is durable and hard to tear and can withstand stresses applied in unpredictable directions. It is the deeper portion of the skin and also can be found in such places as the viscera surrounding the liver, kidney, and spleen. Elastic connective tissue, we see having more elastic fibers because it becomes very stretchy, and we find it in places such as the lungs, air passages, and arterial walls. Then we have cartilage. You've probably heard of the word cartilage. Cartilage is a relatively stiff connective tissue with a flexible rubbery matrix. Cartilage is produced by cells called chondroblasts, which secrete the matrix and surround themselves with it until they become trapped in little cavities called lacunae. Once enclosed in lacunae, the cells are called chondroblasts. Cartilage only rarely exhibits blood vessels, and even when it does, they are just passing through without giving off capillaries to nourish the tissue. Therefore, nutrition and waste removal depend on solute diffusion through the stiff matrix. Because this is a slow process, chondrocytes have low rates of metabolism and cell division, and injured cartilage heals very slowly. There are three kinds of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant cartilage. It functions to ease joint movements, holds airways open during respiration, moves vocal cords during speech. It is a precursor of bone in the fetal skeleton and the growth zones of long bones of children. It can be found in the fetal skeleton and in costal cartilage, which attaches the end of the rib to the breastbone. Then we have elastic cartilage. This provides flexible, elastic support, and we find it in the external ear, and the epiglottis and larynx. Then we have fibrocartilage. It functions to resist compression and absorb shock in some joints. It's often a transitional tissue between dense connective tissue and hyaline cartilage, for example, in a tendon to bone junction. We see it in the pubic symphysis, which is the two halves of the pelvic girdle. We see it in the intervertebral discs, which separate the bones of our vertebral column. We see it in the meniscus and in the pads of shock-absorbing cartilage, such as a knee joint. So it's a shock absorber. Then we have bone. Bone is a connective tissue. It is the hardest and most rigid because it has calcium salts in its matrix. It also has collagen, because although our bones are hard, They also give a little bit, right? Hopefully, if you jump, your bones don't shatter. And this is because they also have some collagen in them. So they provide rigidity and strength to support our body. They function in physical support, leverage of muscle action, protective enclosures of viscera, and a reservoir of calcium and phosphorus. You have two types of bone in your body. You have spongy bone, which fills the head of long bones and forms the middle layer of flat bones, such as the sternum and cranium bones. And you have what's called compact bone. This is a denser calcified tissue with no spaces visible to the naked eye. It forms the external surfaces of all bones, so spongy bone, when present, is always covered by a shell of compact bone. Most compact bone is arranged in cylinders of tissue that surround what's called either a central canal or sometimes it's called a Haversian canal. This runs longitudinal through the shafts of long bones, such as the femur. Blood vessels and nerves travel through the central canals within the bones. The bone matrix is deposited in concentric lamellae, or onion-like layers, around each central canal. A central canal and its surrounding lamellae are called an osteon. The tiny lacunae between the lamellae are occupied by mature bone cells or osteocytes. Delicate canals called caniculi radiate from each lacuna to its neighbors and allow the osteocytes to contact each other. The bone as a whole is covered with a tough, fibrous periosteum, similar to the perichondrium of cartilage. I know that's a lot of new words, but they all do have their specific characteristics and function. Then we have blood. Blood is actually a tissue. It is a fluid connective tissue that travels through tubular blood vessels. Its primary function is to transport cells and dissolved matter from place to place. It functions in our immune systems. It deals with gases, nutrients, waste, chemical signals, and heat throughout the body. It provides defensive leukocytes. It contains clotting agents to minimize bleeding, and platelets secrete growth factors that promote tissue maintenance and repair. It is found in the heart and all the vessels. And there are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Red blood cells deal with oxygen. White blood cells deal with infections. And platelets deal with clotting factors. Then we have muscle tissue. There are 3 types of muscle tissue. These cannot regenerate because the cells are unable to divide. The cells are called muscle fibers due to their long, thin appearance. They have specialized protein fibers that allow them to contract. And this contraction moves the body and produces heat. There are 3 types. There are skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And skeletal muscle cells can be either voluntary or involuntary, meaning either you move them consciously or you do not. So skeletal muscle is voluntary. you are trying to walk. So you are moving those muscles. Your cardiac muscle and your smooth muscle is involuntary. You do not have to think, I want my stomach to contract. You do not have to think every minute of every day, heartbeat, 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 right? Those muscles are involuntary. Skeletal is not. It is attached to the bones and it helps move the body. It deals in facial expression, posture, breathing, speech, swallowing, urination, and defecation. It assists in childbirth, and as I mentioned, is under voluntary control. So these skeletal muscles are mostly attached to bones, but we also see them in the tongue, esophagus, around the lips, eyelids, urethra, and anus. So we see them in sphincters. Cells are elongated and cylindrical, and they have striations, which you can see in the picture. All these little bands. Then you have cardiac tissues. Cardiac tissue is only found in the heart, and it is involuntary, and it has something called an intercalated disc, and that is how you know it is heart tissue. It deals in pumping the blood, and as I mentioned, is under involuntary control. It is only found in the heart. It possesses only one nucleus, and it has striations, again, the banding in the muscle. Then you have smooth muscle tissue. This functions in swallowing and contractions of the stomach and intestine, in the expulsion of feces and urine, labor contractions, control of blood pressure and flow, respiratory airflow. Has to deal with when your pupil dilates, erection of hairs. And again, these are all involuntary. These aren't things that you think about. They just happen. They do not have striations. So you would only see striations in skeletal or cardiac. And the last type is nervous tissue. It deals in internal communication. It is found in the brain, spinal cord, nerves, and ganglia. There are two main types of cells, neurons and neuroglia. Neurons are the main cells. Neuroglia are the supporting cells that nourish, insulate, and protect the neurons. There are different parts. There is a nucleus, there is a cell body, there is an axon and dendrites, and they each deal specifically with basically stimulation and neural impulse. And they respond to environmental changes by making these impulses. The dendrites receive signals from other cells and conduct messages to the neurosoma and the single, much longer axon or nerve fiber, which then sends outgoing signals to other cells. Some axons are more than 1 meter long and can extend from the brainstem all the way to the foot. So the dendrites are picking up information, it is being processed and sent out the axon. Then you have body membranes. So these are thin sheets of tissues, and they line cavities, cover surfaces, or separate tissues and organs. And there can be either epithelial membranes or connective tissue membranes. Epithelial membranes are composed of epithelial tissue overlying loose connective tissue, and they are what we call serous membranes. They line the ventral body cavity and cover internal organs. They secrete serous fluid to reduce friction, such as in the pleural, the pericardium, and the peritoneum. We also have mucous membranes, which line tubes and cavities that open to the exterior. They possess goblet cells to make mucus, and they keep the cells moist and lubricated. And we find these in the digestive and respiratory tracts. You also have cutaneous membrane, and that is the skin. Then we have some connective tissues membranes. And these are formed only of connective tissue, and some examples are meninges, perichondrium, periosteum, and synovial membranes, which are found in joints. And that concludes our tissue lecture. I know it was a lot of information. I know it was probably a lot of new words. I would suggest making flashcards with each type of tissue that we covered, stating its functions and where it could be found. Please let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.